China has tightened its export rules over rare earth minerals in a move that could significantly impact global supply chains for electric vehicles.
And China is pushing back against mounting pressure from the United States, firmly defending its recently announced export controls on rare earths, a key resource in global tech and defense industries.
China is tightening export rules on crucial rare earth minerals. Tesla relies on these, but has said that it plans to strip them out of its cars in the future. And join us now.
America woke up to headlines that didn't sound real. China bans rare earth exports. Not some generic trade restriction, not another tariff spat, but the kind of move that hits the wiring of modern civilization. Just days before a long-anticipated Xi-Trump summit, Beijing made its announcement, a sweeping set of new export controls on critical rare earth minerals. On paper, it looked like an update to environmental policy. In practice, it was a choke point, a reminder that the world's most powerful nation is only as strong as the minerals it can touch. And at that moment, the United States discovered just how little it could touch. For decades, Americans have taken technology for granted. The smooth hum of an iPhone, the glide of an F-35 jet, the precise whisper of a missile guidance chip. Behind every circuit, screen, and sensor lies a hidden ingredient list. Neodymium, dysprosium, terbium, yttrium. Names that sound like they belong in a chemistry textbook, not a war room. But these are the lifeblood of the digital and defense age. Whoever controls them controls the future. China controls more than 80% of the world's supply chain, from the rock pulled out of the ground, to the refined powder, to the finished magnets that drive both Tesla motors and Tomahawk missiles. The United States, despite its technological dominance, produces barely a fraction and refines almost none. So when Beijing moved, it wasn't just a shot across the bow. It was a demonstration that the era of tariff tit-for-tat was over. This was elemental warfare. Inside the West Wing, the response was chaos. Trump, according to aides, erupted in disbelief. He had come to the summit preparing to threaten more tariffs on Chinese imports. Now he found himself defending a supply chain that China could shut down with a single bureaucratic decree. "They're not going to blackmail us with dirt," he reportedly told his staff. But it wasn't dirt anymore. It was destiny. Markets reacted instantly. Defense contractors' shares dipped, tech futures slid, and commodity traders began scouring for alternatives that barely existed. The Pentagon quietly convened emergency meetings to assess exposure. What they found shocked even seasoned analysts. Nearly 78% of critical U.S. defense systems, from radar arrays to precision munitions, rely on components made with Chinese processed rare earths. The Navy's high-performance sonar systems. Dependent. The Air Force's F-35 fighters? Built around magnets refined in China. Even the Army's next-generation missile defense interceptors. Each one requires rare earth alloys mined and refined thousands of miles away, often in regions under Chinese control or influence. It was the ultimate irony. America's cutting-edge weapons were built, quite literally, with materials from its chief rival. Beijing's move wasn't impulsive, it was surgical. For 2 decades, China had cultivated control over this chain, subsidizing miners, tolerating pollution, and slowly undercutting competitors. By the time Washington noticed, the infrastructure, the smelters, the chemistry, all of it was Chinese. Western firms could dig the ore, but only China could refine it. That's why the announcement hit like a thunderclap. It wasn't a ban on a product. It was a reminder of dependence. An invisible weakness turned visible overnight. In Beijing, state media framed it as resource sovereignty. In Washington, analysts called it economic blackmail. Yet both sides knew the truth. This was strategy. Rare earths weren't about profit. They were leverage. At the summit's opening photo op, cameras caught the tension. Xi stood measured, his expression almost serene. Trump, jaw tight, spoke in bursts. Behind them, aides shuffled briefing papers filled with acronyms: REES, DLA, DOD, and worst-case scenarios. The American president, who had built his political identity on toughness against China, now faced a crisis of exposure that toughness alone couldn't fix. Reporters inside the press pool later described the atmosphere as electric and uneasy. One even noted how the handshake lasted a second too long, a minor detail, but symbolic of the imbalance. Xi wasn't there to argue. He was there to show that power had shifted. While Trump railed publicly, tweeting about unfair mineral manipulation, China remained silent. It didn't need to explain itself. The message was embedded in the geology. Back home, the fallout began to spread through industry. The Department of Defense ordered a comprehensive audit of rare earth dependencies. The findings were grim. Roughly 92% of naval sonar components, 85% of Air Force targeting systems, and nearly all advanced missile guidance units contained Chinese processed material. Even the electric vehicles on U.S. bases relied on magnets imported from China. A 2019 GAO report had warned about this scenario. Few listened. Now, every chart and footnote looked prophetic. Trump's advisors scrambled to find quick fixes, reopening mothballed mines in California, accelerating deals with Australia, even exploring new contracts with Canadian refineries still in planning stages. But none of these options could deliver relief fast enough. Building a refining capability from scratch isn't a matter of months, it's a matter of decades. Meanwhile, Beijing tightened inspections, citing national security concerns. Shipments slowed, prices spiked. The global supply of neodymium jumped nearly 40% in a week. For the first time, Washington was forced to confront what a strategic resource really means. Ordinary Americans began to notice the ripple effects in unexpected ways. Tech companies delayed product launches. Electric vehicle manufacturers reported cost surges. Even smartphone prices began to edge upward. Suddenly, an obscure mineral crisis was reaching the kitchen table. And beneath all of this was a deeper story, the collapse of a myth. The myth that global power rested purely on innovation. In reality, power rested on control of the raw materials that make innovation possible. In China's eyes, this wasn't aggression, it was balance. For years, Beijing had endured Western sanctions, export controls on semiconductors, and bans on Huawei. Now, it was their turn to remind the world that dependency cuts both ways. Across the Pacific, the Pentagon's top materials scientist gave a quiet briefing to congressional staff. His words were blunt. If China completely stopped rare earth exports today, the U.S. defense industry would grind to a halt within months. There was no drama in his tone, just fact. Trump's reaction was predictable, outrage mixed with disbelief. He publicly accused China of weaponizing minerals, threatened total economic retaliation, and vowed to make America mineral independent. But independence was easier declared than built. The irony was brutal. Years of offshoring, deregulation, and short-term cost-cutting had handed China a near monopoly, not through conspiracy, but through capitalism. Western firms preferred cheap refining abroad. Chinese companies were happy to oblige. By the time Trump demanded solutions, America's industrial base was hollowed out. Even if new mines opened in Nevada or Alaska, the ore would still need to be shipped to China for processing. In mining towns once proud of their production, like Mountain Pass, California, workers watched the news with a mix of anger and déjà vu. "We used to do this here," one engineer said, "until it got too expensive. Now," he added, "we're paying the price." As the first half of the summit closed, the markets had already rendered their verdict. The Dow slipped, defense stocks wobbled, and Chinese state media ran a headline that read simply, "Who holds the magnet holds the might." It wasn't wrong. The crisis had just begun, and already Washington was realizing that tariffs were child's play compared to what was coming next. A battle not over products, but over elements themselves. In the days that followed the Beijing announcement, the mood in Washington turned from defiance to dread. Behind closed doors, Trump's advisors sifted through intelligence cables, economic forecasts, and Pentagon assessments that all told the same story. The United States was, for the first time in modern history, materially outmatched. Trump's fury was relentless. "We're not going to let China hold our military hostage," he barked during one Oval Office briefing, slamming a folder onto the table. But the options arrayed before him were sobering. Building domestic refineries would take years and billions of dollars. Relying on allies like Japan or Australia meant accepting higher prices and lower capacity. Negotiating with China meant political humiliation. Every path carried risk, and none offered speed. Across the Pacific, China's media played the moment with quiet confidence. Commentaries spoke of resource sovereignty and technological balance, framing the export bans not as aggression, but as a long-overdue correction to Western dominance. The timing, just before the summit, wasn't coincidence. It was choreography. Beijing wanted to remind the world that supply chains, not speeches, decide power. At the Pentagon, contingency plans took shape. Defense officials began exploring scrap recovery, reusing old electronics and weapons parts to extract rare earth materials. Engineers tested substitute alloys. Congress rushed to introduce emergency funding for domestic processing plants. But even with accelerated approvals, America's first modern magnet refinery wouldn't come online for at least 3 years. Allies began to take sides. Canada offered technical partnerships, hoping to expand its own mining operations in Quebec. Australia pledged to double production at its Lynas facilities. Yet both nations knew that even combined, they couldn't fully replace China's refining dominance. Europe, meanwhile, watched in silence, wary of being caught between two giants in a mineral Cold War. And so, the message was unmistakable. This wasn't just about minerals or markets anymore. It was about power, control, and the quiet war waged beneath the surface of global trade. As both nations hardened their stance, the world watched a new Cold War emerge, not fought with bombs or missiles, but with the invisible metals that make the modern world run. And for the first time in decades, America found itself exposed, not by force, but by dependence.